The night air on Guadalcanal carried the smell of rotting vegetation and death. It was October 24th, 1942, and Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone crouched behind a Browning M 1917 machine gun on a muddy ridge south of Henderson Field, listening to the jungle. The sounds coming from the darkness weren't natural. Somewhere out there, beyond the tangled vines and mahogany trees, hundreds of Japanese soldiers were preparing to kill him. Basilone's hands rested on the weapon's spade grips. The gun weighed 41 pounds without its tripod, another 53 pounds with it. Add the water in the cooling jacket, another 8 pounds, and you had a system that required at least 2 men to operate effectively. Tonight, Basilone would operate it alone for most of 14 hours. The barrel temperature would eventually reach over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. His hands would suffer third-degree burns, and before dawn, nearly 40 Japanese soldiers would die in the narrow killing field directly in front of his position. But none of that had happened yet. At this moment, just after nightfall, Basilone was simply a machine gunner doing his job, unaware that he was about to perform what the Marine Corps would later call the most complete individual action of the entire Pacific War. The question that haunts military historians isn't whether one man could hold a position against overwhelming odds. It's what happens inside a human being during those hours that allows the impossible to occur. This is the story of that night. But more importantly, it's the story of what that night cost, and why the man who survived it would choose to return to combat and die on another beach 28 months later. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. John Basilone was born on November 4th, 1916, in Buffalo, New York, the 6th of 10 children born to Salvatore and Theodora Basilone, Italian immigrants who had arrived in America at the turn of the century. His father worked as a tailor. The family spoke Italian at home. They attended Catholic Mass every Sunday. John attended St. Bernard's parochial school, where the nuns found him restless and uninterested in academics. He was not by any measure a remarkable child. At 15, Basilone dropped out of school and found work as a caddy at a local golf course. The pay was minimal, perhaps 50 cents for an 18-hole round if the golfer was generous. In 1934, at age 18, and with limited prospects during the depths of the Great Depression, Basilone did what thousands of young men were doing. He enlisted in the United States Army. His service with the Army took him to the Philippines, where he was stationed at Fort Stotzenberg with the 31st Infantry Regiment. It was there, in Manila, that he acquired the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Manila John. He became proficient in boxing, winning several matches in the Army's recreation leagues. He also received his first formal training on the Browning machine gun, though there was nothing in his service record to suggest exceptional skill. When his 3-year enlistment ended in 1937, he returned to the United States and took a job driving a laundry truck in Raritan, New Jersey. But civilian life proved unsatisfying. In July of 1940, with Europe already at war and tensions rising in the Pacific, Basilone walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station in Baltimore and enlisted. He was 23 years old, older than most recruits, who tended to be 18 or 19. The recruiting sergeant asked why he wanted to join the Marines instead of re-enlisting in the Army. Basilone's answer was simple: "I want to be the best." He completed recruit training at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island in South Carolina. The training was brutal by design: 12 weeks of physical conditioning, weapons training, close order drill, and psychological indoctrination intended to strip away civilian identity and rebuild recruits as Marines. Drill instructors noted that Basilone was more disciplined than younger recruits, less prone to homesickness or panic. His prior Army service gave him an edge in weapons handling. Upon graduation, he was assigned to the machine gun section, a specialty that required not just marksmanship, but an understanding of fields of fire, ammunition, conservation, and the ability to remain calm under sustained enemy assault. By June of 1942, Bazzaloni had been promoted to sergeant and assigned to 1st Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division. The division was preparing for deployment to the South Pacific. Nobody in the unit knew where they were going or what they would face, but rumours circulated constantly. Some said they would garrison duty in New Zealand. Others whispered about offensive operations against Japanese-held islands. The truth was that High Command itself was still deciding. The strategic situation in the Pacific in mid-1942 was precarious. 6 months earlier, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the United States Pacific Fleet. In the months that followed, Japan had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and dozens of islands across the Pacific. American military planners recognized that if Japan consolidated these gains and established air bases throughout the region, the supply line to Australia would be cut, and any future offensive to roll back Japanese conquests would become exponentially more difficult. In July of 1942, Allied intelligence discovered that Japanese forces were constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal, a largely unknown island in the Solomon Islands chain. The island itself was unremarkable, approximately 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered in dense jungle, coconut plantations, and malarial swamps. Its climate was oppressively hot and humid, but its strategic value was enormous. An operational Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal would allow Japanese aircraft to interdict Allied shipping lanes and threaten Australia directly. The decision was made to seize the island before the airfield became operational. The mission, codenamed Operation Watchtower, though Marines would later call it Operation Shoestring due to inadequate supplies and preparation time, would be the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. The 1st Marine Division, including John Bazzaloni's 7th Marine Regiment, would conduct the assault. On August 7, 1942, 11,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal and the neighbouring islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The landings on Guadalcanal itself encountered almost no resistance. The Japanese construction workers and the small garrison force fled into the jungle. By the afternoon of August 8th, Marines had captured the airfield, which they renamed Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. The ease of the initial landing created a false sense that the campaign might be brief. This illusion lasted approximately 48 hours. On the night of August 8th to 9th, a Japanese naval force surprised and annihilated an Allied cruiser force at the Battle of Savo Island, sinking 4 heavy cruisers and killing over 1,000 Allied sailors in less than an hour. It was one of the worst naval defeats in American history. More importantly, it left the Marines on Guadalcanal isolated. The transports carrying most of their supplies, heavy equipment, and artillery withdrew before being fully unloaded. The 1st Marine Division was stranded on a hostile island with limited ammunition, minimal rations, and no certainty of resupply or reinforcement. The Japanese High Command, recognizing the strategic importance of Henderson Field, immediately began pouring reinforcements onto the island. Troop transports, which the Marines nicknamed the Tokyo Express, ran nightly down a sea route called the Slot, depositing hundreds of soldiers along the coast. Japanese commanders were confident they could quickly overwhelm the American garrison. Initial intelligence suggested there were only 2,000 Marines on the island. In reality, there were closer to 11,000, but the Japanese strategic assumption remained unchanged. Americans could not withstand a determined Japanese assault. This assumption was rooted in Japanese military doctrine developed during the wars in China and against European colonial forces in Asia. Japanese infantry tactics emphasized aggressive night attacks, close combat with bayonets, and the psychological impact of mass assaults. The term Banzai charge would later become shorthand for these attacks, though the Japanese military referred to them more formally as offensive night attacks or infiltration assaults. The goal was not merely to kill enemy soldiers, but to create panic, to break the enemy's will to fight through overwhelming auditory and visual stimulation, screaming, bugles, the sight of hundreds of men charging directly into defensive fire without apparent fear of death. These tactics had proven effective against Chinese nationalist forces and against British and Australian defenders in Malaya and Singapore. Japanese officers believed American Marines, most of whom had never experienced combat, would similarly break under pressure. They were about to discover they were wrong. By mid-October of 1942, the Marine defensive perimeter around Henderson Field had contracted to a narrow strip of jungle and beach. The perimeter was shaped roughly like a horseshoe, with both ends anchored on the coast and the curve protecting the airfield. The 7th Marine Regiment, including John Basiloni's unit, was positioned along the southern edge of this perimeter, in a sector that would later be called Coffin Corner because of the casualties sustained there. The terrain was nightmarish. Dense jungle growth limited visibility to mere yards in most places. The ground was a mixture of volcanic soil and mud, which turned into soup during the frequent torrential rains. Foxholes filled with water within minutes of being dug. Mosquitoes were omnipresent, carrying malaria and dengue fever. Dysentery was epidemic. Rations were severely limited. One Marine later recalled subsisting on a third of a canteen of water per day and maybe a handful of rice if we were lucky. Japanese snipers infiltrated the American lines constantly, firing from concealed positions in trees or dense undergrowth, then disappearing before Marines could locate them. Japanese artillery positioned beyond the range of Marine counter-battery fire shelled the perimeter every night. The psychological stress was enormous. Few Marines slept for more than an hour or two at a time. Everyone developed some degree of what would later be called combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress disorder. Into this environment came intelligence reports in mid-October that the Japanese were preparing a major offensive. Captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed that the Japanese 17th Army, under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, was concentrating forces for an all-out assault on the Marine perimeter. The attack would be led by Major General Masao Maruyama's 2nd Division, approximately 7,000 elite troops, many of them veterans of combat in China. The objective was to break through the American lines, capture Henderson Field, and eliminate the Marine garrison entirely. Marine commanders knew the attack was coming, but didn't know exactly when or where the main thrust would occur. Every unit on the perimeter was placed on full alert. Machine gun crews, including John Basiloni's section, were ordered to prepare for sustained defensive fire. Ammunition was stockpiled. Fields of fire were cleared. Foxholes were reinforced as much as the waterlogged ground would allow. Basiloni's machine gun section consisted of 2 Browning M 1917 30 caliber machine guns, positioned approximately 50 yards apart on a narrow ridge. Each gun had a crew of 3, a gunner, an assistant gunner who fed ammunition belts into the weapon, and an ammunition carrier who brought forward additional belts from the ammunition point, located about 100 yards to the rear. Supporting the machine guns were approximately a dozen riflemen from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The Browning M 1917 was an excellent defensive weapon, but it had significant limitations. It was heavy and required a tripod mount, making it unsuitable for mobile operations. It was water-cooled, meaning it had a brass jacket surrounding the barrel that had to be filled with water to prevent overheating during sustained fire. When functioning properly and adequately cooled, the weapon could fire approximately 450 to 600 rounds per minute, depending on the skill of the gunner. The effective range was about 1,000 yards, though most combat engagements occurred at far closer distances. The critical vulnerability of the weapon was heat management. During sustained fire, the water in the cooling jacket would begin to boil. If the water level dropped too low, the barrel would overheat rapidly, causing malfunctions or even warping the barrel itself. In combat conditions, this meant that crews had to carefully manage their rate of fire, firing in short bursts rather than continuous streams, and periodically refilling the water jacket. This was difficult enough under normal circumstances. Under the conditions, Basilone would face hours of continuous fire. Against multiple mass assaults, it would become nearly impossible. The ammunition for the M1917 came in fabric belts, with each belt holding 250 rounds. A sustained firefight could consume dozens of belts. This created a logistical challenge. Ammunition was heavy, and in the muddy jungle terrain of Guadalcanal, bringing forward fresh belts from the rear ammunition point was exhausting and dangerous work, especially under enemy fire. Basilone understood these limitations intimately. He had been drilling his gun crews for weeks, emphasizing ammunition discipline and the importance of maintaining the water level in the cooling jacket. But no amount of training could truly prepare anyone for what was about to happen. The assault began shortly after dark on October 24th. Japanese artillery opened fire, first mortars and mountain guns targeting known Marine positions. The bombardment lasted approximately 30 minutes, intended to suppress the defenders and create gaps in the defensive wire. Marines huddled in their foxholes as shells exploded around them, sending fountains of mud and shrapnel in all directions. The noise was tremendous, not just the explosions themselves, but the whine of incoming shells and the crack of trees being splintered by near misses. Then the artillery stopped. In the sudden silence, Marines along the perimeter heard something that would become a recurring nightmare for many who survived Guadalcanal. The sound of hundreds of Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle, accompanied by shouting, the clatter of equipment, and occasionally the sound of officers barking orders in Japanese. Then came the screaming. The first Banzai charge hit the Marine lines at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle and charged directly at the Marine positions, bayonets fixed, screaming, "Banzai!" and "Marine, you die!" The psychological impact was enormous. This wasn't the carefully controlled fire and maneuver tactics that American training emphasized. This was a human wave, men packed shoulder to shoulder, running directly into defensive fire with no apparent concern for their own survival. John Basilone opened fire. The machine gun roared, spitting out rounds at a rate of approximately 8 per second. The sound was deafening, a continuous hammering that drowned out almost everything else. Brass casings ejected from the right side of the weapon, piling up in the mud. The assistant gunner fed ammunition belts into the receiver, hands moving in a practiced rhythm. Japanese soldiers fell in rows, but the charge continued. There were simply too many targets. Basilone swept the gun back and forth in controlled traverses, methodical and precise, even as chaos erupted around him. The Marines held. After perhaps 20 minutes of sustained combat, the Japanese charge faltered and fell back into the jungle, leaving dozens of bodies in front of the Marine positions. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 14 hours, Basilone's position would face 4 more major assaults and numerous smaller probing attacks, and by dawn, almost everyone around him would be dead. The second assault came approximately 1 hour after the first. This time, the Japanese changed their approach. Instead of a single massive frontal assault, they attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, probing for weak points in the Marine line. Mortar fire rained down continuously, creating a curtain of explosions that made communication between positions nearly impossible. In the darkness and confusion, Basilone's machine gun section began to disintegrate. A mortar round landed directly in the fighting position of the second machine gun, approximately 50 yards to Basilone's left. The explosion killed the gunner, Private First Class James Cowan, instantly. The assistant gunner was wounded severely enough that he had to be evacuated. Another Marine, attempting to reach the position with fresh ammunition, was hit by rifle fire and went down screaming in the darkness. Within minutes, the second gun was out of action. Basilone's own crew was also taking casualties. His assistant gunner was hit by shrapnel from a near-miss mortar round. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it was severe enough that the man could no longer perform his duties. He was dragged back toward the aid station. The ammunition carrier took over as assistant gunner, but he too was wounded within the hour, a rifle bullet through the shoulder that shattered his collarbone. By midnight, approximately 3 hours into the battle, John Basilone was effectively alone. The riflemen on either side of his position had either been killed, wounded, or pulled back to fill gaps elsewhere in the line. His gun crew was gone. The second machine gun was destroyed. He had perhaps 1,500 rounds of ammunition remaining in belts stacked beside his position, and Japanese forces were massing in the jungle for another assault. According to later accounts from Marines who survived that night, Basilone could have withdrawn. The tactical situation was untenable. A single man could not effectively operate a crew-served weapon for extended periods, especially under the conditions he was facing. His commanding officer, if still alive and able to communicate, would likely have ordered him to fall back to a secondary defensive position. Nobody would have questioned the decision. But Basilone understood something that pure military logic couldn't account for. If he abandoned his position, there would be a gap in the Marine line. Japanese forces would pour through that gap. Behind him, perhaps 200 yards away, were the aid station, the command post, and dozens of wounded Marines who couldn't defend themselves. Further back was Henderson Field itself. If the Japanese broke through here, the entire southern sector of the defense might collapse. So, he stayed. The third major assault came around 1 o'clock in the morning. Intelligence reports compiled after the battle suggest this assault involved at least 300 Japanese soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 29th Infantry Regiment. They advanced in a column formation through the jungle, then deployed into an assault formation approximately 100 yards from Basilone's position. The charge that followed was, by all accounts, terrifying. Japanese soldiers screamed as they ran, some waving swords, others firing rifles from the hip. A few threw grenades that exploded harmlessly in the mud, too far from Basilone's position to cause damage, but close enough to create fountains of debris and smoke. The noise was overwhelming not just the enemy, but Basilone's own machine gun, which he was now firing in longer bursts than doctrine recommended, sweeping back and forth across the entire front of his position. The Browning M1917 performed exactly as designed for a while. But Basilone was pushing the weapon beyond its normal operational parameters. The recommended maximum sustained rate of fire was approximately 150 rounds per minute in bursts. Basilone was firing at nearly 3 times that rate. The water in the cooling jacket began to boil. He could hear it a hissing, bubbling sound beneath the mechanical hammer of the gun's action. Steam began to vent from the filling port on top of the water jacket. This was a warning sign. Under normal circumstances, a gun crew would cease fire, allow the weapon to cool, and refill the water jacket using canteens or water from nearby shell holes. But Basilone didn't have a gun crew. He didn't have time. Japanese soldiers were now within 50 yards of his position, close enough that he could see individual faces in the muzzle flashes from his weapon. He kept firing. The barrel began to glow. First a dull red, visible only in complete darkness, then brighter, orange-red, hot, enough to be seen clearly, even with the ambient light from explosions and tracer rounds. The metal of the barrel was approaching 900 to 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, steel becomes malleable. The barrel was beginning to warp slightly, which would eventually affect accuracy and potentially cause catastrophic failure. Basilone's hands were now in constant contact with superheated metal. The spade grips of the weapon, thick metal handles designed to allow the gunner to traverse and elevate the weapon, were conducting heat from the barrel and receiver. Even through gloves, the temperature was unbearable. According to medical records filed weeks later at a field hospital, Basilone suffered 3rd-degree burns across both palms and several fingers. 3rd-degree burns destroy not just the surface layers of skin but the dermis beneath, damaging nerve endings and often requiring skin grafts to repair. But in the moment, Basilone didn't stop to examine his injuries. Pain was irrelevant. The Japanese assault was reaching its peak. Bodies were piling up in front of his position, not an exaggeration or figure of speech, but a literal statement of fact. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive assault even in the face of defensive fire, and officers drove their men forward with a combination of ideological fervour and threats of disgrace. Soldiers who fell wounded or killed became obstacles that following waves had to climb over or circumvent. The third assault lasted perhaps 30 minutes before breaking. The casualties were catastrophic. Post-battle assessments by Marine intelligence officers who walked the battlefield estimated that between 80 and 100 Japanese soldiers died in front of Bazzaloni's position during this single assault. The survivors retreated into the jungle, leaving their wounded behind. Marines could hear Japanese wounded crying out in the darkness, some calling for medics, others apparently calling for their mothers, a universal phenomenon in combat regardless of nationality. Bazzaloni used the lull to assess his situation. It was not good. His machine gun was still functional, but the barrel was severely overheated and possibly damaged. The water jacket was nearly empty, the water had boiled away, and he had no way to refill it in the darkness without exposing himself to sniper fire. His hands were badly burned, though he later stated he didn't fully register the pain at the time, possibly due to adrenaline, possibly because some of the nerve endings had been destroyed. Most critically, he was almost out of ammunition. Perhaps 300 rounds remained enough for perhaps 2 minutes of sustained fire, maybe less. The nearest ammunition point was approximately 100 yards to the rear, through a jungle that was now likely infiltrated with Japanese soldiers. Every few minutes, he would hear movement in the undergrowth, the snap of a twig, the rustle of vegetation, and he couldn't tell if it was Japanese infiltrators, wounded Marines trying to crawl back to friendly lines, or simply the jungle itself. He had two choices: remain in position with inadequate ammunition and wait for the next assault, which would almost certainly overrun him, or abandon the gun and retreat to a secondary position. Military doctrine provided a third option that Bazzaloni apparently never considered. He could have sent a runner if any were available to bring ammunition forward. Instead, John Bazzaloni did something that defies standard tactical logic. He left his position, carrying only a .45 caliber pistol and a machete, and went to get ammunition himself. What happened during the next 30 minutes is reconstructed from Bazzaloni's own sparse statements given weeks later, and from the accounts of other Marines who encountered him during or immediately after the ammunition run. Bazzalone was not a man given to elaborating on his own actions, and most of what is known comes from official after-action reports and second-hand accounts. He moved through the jungle using a combination of memory and dead reckoning. There were no lights, even dim red flashlights would attract enemy fire. The jungle canopy blocked most moonlight. Visibility was measured in feet, not yards. He navigated by feel, touching trees and large roots to orient himself, listening for the sounds of fighting to maintain his directional sense. Japanese soldiers were everywhere in the sector behind the front line. These weren't organized assault formations, but rather small groups infiltrators who had slipped through gaps in the Marine perimeter, wounded soldiers who had become separated from their units, and advanced scouts preparing for the next major push. Marines later found Japanese bodies throughout this area, some killed by rifle fire, others by close-range pistol shots or edged weapons. Bazzalone later stated that he encountered at least 3 Japanese soldiers during his movement to the ammunition point. He killed 2 with his pistol and 1 with the machete, though he provided no details about these encounters. Combat at close range in complete darkness is chaotic and often brief. Both sides are operating primarily on instinct and reaction rather than conscious thought. It is entirely possible that some of these encounters lasted only seconds, a shape in the darkness, movement, a moment of recognition, violence, and then silence. He reached the ammunition dump, actually just a covered pit, where ammunition belts were stacked on wooden pallets to keep them out of the mud, and loaded himself with as many .30 caliber belts as he could physically carry. Each belt weighed approximately 7 pounds. Bazzalone was approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed perhaps 160 pounds. Contemporary accounts suggest he carried between 8 and 12 belts, somewhere between 56 and 84 pounds of ammunition slung across his shoulders and wrapped around his torso. Then he had to get back. The return journey was even more dangerous than the outbound trip. He was now heavily loaded, which slowed his movement and made him louder. Japanese forces were more alert, having heard firing in the rear area, and time was critical. He could hear the sounds of another Japanese assault building in the jungle ahead of him. He made it back to his position with perhaps 5 minutes to spare. Other Marines who saw him emerge from the darkness later described him as looking like a walking ammunition dump, festooned with belts of .30 caliber rounds. His uniform was torn and muddy. His hands were visibly burned. One Marine remembered seeing raw, exposed flesh where the skin had peeled away. Basilone dropped the ammunition belts beside his gun, took a moment to refill the water jacket using water from nearby shell holes, not clean water, but at this point it didn't matter, and prepared for the next assault. It came minutes later. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fourth and fifth assaults blurred together in Basilone's memory and in the accounts of other Marines who survived the night. By this point, it was approximately 3 o'clock in the morning. The battle had been raging for 6 hours. The Japanese commanders, frustrated by their inability to break through the Marine line, were throwing everything they had at the southern perimeter. These final assaults were less organized than the earlier ones. Japanese units had taken enormous casualties. Command and control had broken down. Officers who might have coordinated attacks were dead. Yet the assaults continued, driven by a combination of tactical necessity they had to break through before dawn and the psychological momentum of the attack itself. Soldiers who had spent hours working themselves into a combat frenzy, who I had seen their comrades die, who faced the prospect of retreat and disgrace, continued to charge forward even when the tactical situation was hopeless. Basilone fired until the barrel of his machine gun was glowing white-hot, visible even at a distance in the darkness. The weapon should have failed, the barrel should have warped beyond function, the headspace and timing should have gone out of alignment, the sustained heat should have caused some critical component to crack or seize. But the Browning M 1917 was one of the most reliable machine guns ever manufactured, and it continued to function even under conditions its designers never anticipated. His hands were destroyed. Medical personnel who treated him days later found burns so severe that they initially considered evacuating him to a rear area hospital in Australia. The skin on his palms had been burned away entirely in some places, exposing muscle and tendon beneath. Several fingers were burned down to the bone. He would carry scars from these injuries for the rest of his life. But in the moment, Basilone apparently felt little pain. Multiple combat veterans have described this phenomenon, a combination of adrenaline, shock, and psychological dissociation that allows soldiers to continue functioning even with severe injuries. The body's pain response, designed to protect the organism by signaling damage, becomes counterproductive in combat situations where stopping means death. As dawn approached, the Japanese assaults weakened and finally ceased. Japanese commanders had committed approximately 3,000 soldiers to the assault on the southern perimeter. Nearly 900 were dead. Hundreds more were wounded. The attack had failed completely. The Marine line had held. When the sun rose on October 25, 1942, Marines along the perimeter began to assess the damage. In front of John Basilone's position, the scene was almost incomprehensible. Bodies were stacked in heaps, in some places 3 or 4 deep. The exact count is disputed. Different sources provide different figures, but most estimates place the number of Japanese dead directly attributable to Basilone's machine gun at between 38 and 50 soldiers, with many more wounded who later died or were evacuated. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The ground in front of his position was churned mud, brass casings, and blood. The vegetation had been shredded by machine gun fire, and his weapon, the Browning M 1917 that had fired for most of 14 hours, was barely recognizable. The barrel was warped from heat. The water jacket was dry and discolored. Carbon fouling coated every moving part. But it did not fail. Other Marines who saw Basilone that morning described him as looking like he was in shock. He was filthy, covered in mud and cordite residue. His hands were wrapped in pieces of torn cloth, blood seeping through. He had been awake and in continuous combat for over 14 hours. Most men in that condition would have collapsed from exhaustion. Basilone walked to the aid station under his own power, where a Navy corpsman, the medics who served with Marine units, began treating his burns. The corpsman later stated that Basilone barely spoke, answering questions in monosyllables, staring at nothing in particular. This was not unusual. Combat exhaustion produced a kind of psychological numbness that could last hours or days. Within a week, Basilone's actions on that night became known throughout the 1st Marine Division. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Louis B. Puller himself, later a legend in Marine Corps history, filed a recommendation for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The recommendation worked its way up through channels as the Guadalcanal campaign continued. The campaign itself lasted until early February of 1943, when the last Japanese forces evacuated the island. The cost was staggering. The United States lost approximately 1,600 personnel killed in action, with thousands more wounded or incapacitated by disease. Japanese losses were far worse, approximately 31,000 personnel dead, many from starvation and disease rather than combat. Basilone was evacuated from Guadalcanal in early 1943, officially for medical treatment of his hands, but also because by this point he had become too valuable to risk in further combat. The Marine Corps recognized that it had a genuine hero, a working-class enlisted man who had performed an extraordinary action, who fit the profile of the kind of hero the American public needed to see. On October 24, 1943, exactly 1 year after the battle, Basilone was awarded the Medal of Honor by Major General Alexander Vandergrift in a ceremony in Australia. The citation read, in part, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy Japanese forces, above and beyond the call of duty, while serving with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, in the Lunga area, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, on October 24th and 25th, 1942, while the enemy was hammering at the Marines' defensive positions, Sergeant Basilone, in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, fought valiantly to check the savage and determined assault. In a fierce frontal attack with the Japanese blasting his guns with grenades and mortar fire, one of Sergeant Basilone's sections, with its gun crews, was put out of action, leaving only 2 men able to carry on. Moving an extra gun into position, he placed it in action, then, under continual fire, repaired another and personally manned it, gallantly holding his line until replacements arrived. A little later, with ammunition critically low and the supply lines cut off, Sergeant Basilone, at great risk of his life and in the face of continued enemy attack, battled his way through hostile lines with urgently needed shells for his gunners, thereby contributing in large measure to the virtual annihilation of a Japanese regiment. He was the first enlisted Marine in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor. He was promoted to gunnery sergeant, and he was sent back to the United States for what the military called a war bond tour. For the next year, John Basilone became America's Marine. He was paraded through cities across the country: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, his hometown of Raritan, New Jersey. He gave speeches at factories and schools. He shook hands with politicians and movie stars. He appeared at rallies where thousands of people came to see the hero of Guadalcanal. Everywhere he went, crowds mobbed him. Women proposed marriage. Children asked for his autograph. He raised millions of dollars in war bond sales, money that funded ships, aircraft, and weapons. And he hated every minute of it. Multiple accounts, from people who knew Basilone during this period, describe him as increasingly uncomfortable with his celebrity. He was not a natural public speaker. He found the constant attention exhausting. But more than that, he felt that the adulation was misplaced. In interviews, the few he agreed to give, he consistently deflected praise, stating that he had only done his job, that dozens of other Marines had performed equally brave actions that went unrecognized, that the real heroes were the men who died. There was something else, though contemporary sources are less explicit about this. Basilone was suffering from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares. He drank heavily. Friends noticed that loud noises, a door slamming, a car backfiring would cause him to flinch or momentarily freeze. At one war bond rally, someone set off fireworks as part of the celebration. Basilone reportedly dove for cover, then stood up looking embarrassed and shaken. In early 1944, Basilone requested permission to return to combat duty. The Marine Corps refused. He was too valuable as a symbol. They offered him a commission he could become an officer, serve as an instructor at a stateside training base, and never face combat again. The offer came with a significant pay increase and the promise of a comfortable posting near his family. Basilone refused. He wanted to return to a combat unit. He submitted multiple requests through proper channels. Each was denied. So he went over his immediate superiors' heads and contacted senior Marine Corps officers directly, arguing that keeping him stateside while other Marines were dying was wrong. During this period, he met Lena May Riggi, a sergeant in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. She was one of the first women to serve in the Marine Corps, working as a field cook instructor at Camp Pendleton in California. They met at a training event in early 1944. According to Lena's later accounts, she was initially unaware of who Basilone was or what he had done. When she found out, she was unimpressed. She had no patience for men who traded on their fame. Basilone apparently appreciated this. They began dating. They were married on July 10, 1944, at St. Mary's Star of the Sea Church in Oceanside, California. The ceremony was small and private, though the press covered it extensively. Photographs from the wedding show Basilone in his dress uniform, wearing the Medal of Honor around his neck, looking genuinely happy, one of the few photographs of him from this period where he appears relaxed. Lena later stated that their time together was brief and intense. Basilone would wake in the middle of the night, sweating, sometimes shouting. He told her about Guadalcanal, not in heroic terms, but in fragments, images that haunted him. The bodies, the heat of the machine gun barrel, the faces of Japanese soldiers in his gun sights. The weight of carrying the ammunition through the jungle while men were dying. She asked him why he wanted to go back. According to her account, he said something like, "The men still over there, they know what it's like. The people back here, they think it's all parades and speeches. I need to be with people who understand." In December of 1944, after months of requests, the Marine Corps finally relented. Basilone was assigned to Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 27th Marine Regiment, 5th Marine Division. The division was training for a major amphibious assault. The target was not yet disclosed to most personnel, but senior leaders knew Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was a volcanic island approximately 4.5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide, located about 660 miles south of Tokyo. It was strategically vital Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima could intercept American B-29 bombers flying from the Marianas to bomb Japan. Conversely, if American forces captured the island, it would provide a forward base for fighter escorts and an emergency landing site for damaged bombers. The Japanese had turned Iwo Jima into a fortress. Over 22,000 Japanese soldiers and naval personnel were garrisoned there, under the command of Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. They had spent months digging tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions throughout the island. Kuribayashi, unlike many Japanese commanders, had no interest in Banzai charges or glorious last stands. His strategy was attritional warfare, making every foot of ground cost the Americans as much blood as possible. American intelligence estimated the island could be captured in 3 to 5 days. The actual battle would last 36 days and become one of the bloodiest in Marine Corps history. The invasion began on February 19, 1945. Basilone went ashore with the 5th Wave, landing on Red Beach 2 on the southeastern coast of the island. The beach was a nightmare, steep terraces of volcanic ash that vehicles couldn't traverse, creating traffic jams of men and equipment, all under heavy Japanese fire from Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak that dominated the southern end of the island. Japanese defenders had waited until the beach was crowded with Marines and equipment before opening fire. Artillery, mortars and machine guns from fortified positions poured fire onto the landing zone. Marines took cover behind the volcanic terraces, but the ash was so loose that digging proper foxholes was nearly impossible. Men sank into the ash with every step. Vehicles bogged down. The carefully planned assault timetable collapsed within minutes. Bazalone's company was tasked with moving inland from the beach toward Airfield No. 1, approximately 400 yards from the waterline. To get there, they had to cross a killing field swept by Japanese machine gun fire and advance through a minefield. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, Bazalone identified the problem. A Japanese blockhouse, a reinforced concrete fortification, was pinning down the American advance with machine gun fire. The position was too strong to be taken by rifle fire alone. It needed to be destroyed with demolitions. Bazalone grabbed a demolition team and led them forward. Marines who witnessed this later stated that he moved as if he were simply going about a routine task, seemingly oblivious to the bullets snapping past him. He reached the blockhouse, placed charges, and destroyed it. The Japanese machine gun position was neutralized, but the minefield remained. American tanks attempting to advance were hitting mines and being disabled. Without armor support, the infantry advance would stall, leaving Marines exposed on the beach under constant fire. Bazalone moved to one of the stalled tanks and climbed onto its hull. Under fire, he guided the tank through a safe path around the minefield, physically pointing out mines he could see partially exposed in the volcanic ash. The tank made it through. Other tanks followed. The advance resumed. It was approximately 10 o'clock in the morning when the mortar round hit. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Some state that Bazalone was guiding a second tank when the round landed. Others say he had returned to his platoon and was coordinating their advance. What is certain is that a Japanese mortar round, probably an 81mm round, based on fragment analysis, landed within a few feet of John Bazalone. The explosion killed him instantly. He was 28 years old. He had been in Iwo Jima for less than an hour. 4 other Marines were killed by the same blast. Private First Class Charles W. Chuck Tatum, Corporal Robert R. Lanes, and 2 others, whose names are less clearly documented in the historical record. Bazalone's body was initially buried on Iwo Jima in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery, then later reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. For his actions on Iwo Jima, the destruction of the blockhouse and guiding the tank through the minefield, John Bazalone was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States Armed Forces. The citation read, in part, "For extraordinary heroism while serving as a leader of a machine gun section, Company C, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division, in action against enemy Japanese forces on Iwo Jima in the Volcano Islands, 19th February, 1945. Shrewdly gauging the tactical situation shortly after landing when his company's advance was held up by the concentrated fire of a heavily fortified Japanese blockhouse, Gunnery Sergeant Bazalone boldly defied the smashing bombardment of heavy-caliber fire to work his way around the flank and up to a position directly on top of the blockhouse, and then, attacking with grenades and demolitions, single-handedly destroyed the entire hostile strongpoint and its defending garrison. John Bazalone remains the only enlisted Marine to have received both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross in World War II. But awards and citations don't capture what his death meant to the people who knew him. Lena Mae Bazalone received the notification in California. She never remarried. She spent the rest of her life. She died in 1999, working to preserve her husband's memory and supporting veterans' causes. In interviews later in life, she stated that she understood why he had gone back, even though she hated that he had made that choice. He couldn't live with being safe while other Marines were dying. The Marines who had served with Basilone on Guadalcanal and who survived the war had mixed reactions to his death. Some felt it was a waste that a man who had already done so much shouldn't have been allowed to return to combat. Others understood it differently. One veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, put it this way: Manila John couldn't be a hero back home because being a hero meant he'd survived when his buddies didn't. The only way he could live with himself was to go back and be with Marines who understood. And if that killed him, well, at least he died doing what he felt was right. The strategic outcome of Iwo Jima justified the cost, at least in military terms. American forces captured the island on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of fighting. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed and 19,000 wounded. Approximately 21,000 Japanese soldiers died. Only around 1,000 survived to surrender, despite expectations of far higher prisoner numbers. The island served as an emergency landing site for over 2,400 B-29 bombers during the final months of the war, potentially saving the lives of thousands of American airmen. Whether this justified the cost in American casualties remains debated by historians. But for the Marines who fought there, the calculations were simpler. They had a mission. They accomplished it. Men died doing their jobs. John Basilone was one of those men. In the decades since World War II, John Basilone has become a legend in Marine Corps culture. Every Marine recruit learns his name and his story during basic training. The Machine Gun Battalion School at Camp Pendleton is named Basilone Hall. A destroyer escort, the USS Basilone, was commissioned in 1949 and served until 1977. His hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, holds an annual parade in his honor, the largest Memorial Day parade in the United States, drawing tens of thousands of participants and spectators. But the real legacy is harder to quantify. It's in the concept of mission accomplishment over personal survival that defines Marine Corps ethos. It's in the understanding that sometimes one person, in the right place at the right time, can make a difference that seems impossible. It's in the recognition that heroism isn't about seeking glory, it's about staying when every rational instinct says to run. On the night of October 24th to 25th, 1942, John Basilone could have abandoned his position. He could have retreated to a secondary line. Nobody would have blamed him. His gun crew was gone. His ammunition was depleted. The tactical situation was hopeless. But behind him were Marines who couldn't defend themselves. Behind him was an aid station full of wounded men. Behind him was Henderson Field, and if Henderson Field fell, Guadalcanal would fall, and if Guadalcanal fell, the entire Allied strategy in the Pacific might collapse. So he stayed. He burned his hands to the bone. He fought his way through enemy lines to get ammunition. He fired until his weapon glowed white-hot, and when dawn came, the line had held. 2.5 years later, on a black sand beach on Iwo Jima, John Basilone made a similar choice. He saw Marines pinned down. He saw a tactical problem that was costing lives, and he moved forward to fix it, knowing the risks, accepting them as part of the job. That's what the speeches and the parades and the memorials all miss. John Basilone wasn't a hero because he did something extraordinary once and then spent the rest of his life being celebrated for it. He was a hero because when the moment came twice, he chose mission over safety, chose his brothers over himself, chose to act when action was almost certainly fatal. The machine gun section he commanded on Guadalcanal received credit for killing nearly 40 Japanese soldiers that night. Basilone himself probably killed more than that across both Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. But the real measure of his impact isn't in bodies counted or awards received. It's in the Marines who survived because he held that line. It's in the airmen whose damaged B-29s limped into Iwo Jima and landed safely. It's in every Marine who has heard his story and understood what it means to be a Marine. It means you don't quit. It means you don't abandon your post. It means that when the moment comes to choose between the easy path and the right path, you choose right, even when right means pain, even when right means scars, even when right means death. That's the lesson of Manila John Basilone. Not that one man can hold off an army, though he did. Not that heroism looks like something from a movie it usually doesn't. But ordinary people, when pushed to extraordinary circumstances, can sometimes do things that seem impossible, and that those choices matter. They matter to the people saved. They matter to the mission accomplished. They matter to everyone who comes after and needs to know that when the darkness comes, when everything is lost, someone will stand. John Basilone stood, twice. That's why his name endures. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.